It's its natural resources. Much of Europe depends on Russia for its oil and for its natural gas. And this creates a tremendous amount of leverage on their neighbors. One of the reasons why you have seen some countries in Europe reluctant to move forward on even higher sanctions is because they are afraid of losing access to natural gas and oil from Russia that their economy depends on. We need to change that. That can't happen overnight, but we need to begin to change that. First, by increasing our exports to those countries, in particular Ukraine. And I know Senator Barrasso will have an amendment as part of this debate that I hope will be considered that will allow us to export more natural gas to Ukraine. But the other thing that needs to happen is that other countries in Europe need to develop their own domestic capabilities in natural gas so they can become less reliant on Russia for these resources and become more reliant on themselves and free countries in the region to be able to do that. And that's a critical component of a long-term strategy in all of this. Let me just close by answering the question I began with. Why does this matter? And I think this matters for a lot of different reasons. I've highlighted one in terms of decisions that are being made around the world and governments that have to decide whether they're going to pursue their own domestic nuclear weapons capability or not. But there's another that perhaps we need to think about. After World War II, in fact, after the last century, when the world went through two devastating world wars, there was a commitment made that no longer would nations be allowed to aggressively invade other countries and take over territory and exercise legitimate claims. In fact, international norms were established at the end of World War II. Now, it had some conflicts during the Cold War with Russia, with the Soviet Union, and with the spread of communism. But by and large, especially since the end of the Cold War, that's been the established norm. It is not acceptable in the late 20th century and in the early 21st century for a country to simply make up an excuse and invade a neighbor and take their land and their territory. That perhaps was the way of the world 300 years ago, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, and there were massive wars and loss of life as a result of countries doing that. But the world grew tired of these conflicts and decided we will no longer tolerate or accept these sorts of things. If you recall, in the early 1990s, Saddam Hussein did that. He invaded Kuwait, and the entire world community rallied around the United States of America to expel him from there as a result of that illegitimate action. But now in the 21st century, you have the most egregious violation of that norm. You basically have Russia that has decided that we don't like the way things are going in Ukraine, and so we're going to invade. We're going to take over a territory. And think about how they did it. They deny that they're doing it. They send Russian troops into Crimea, but they had them wear uniforms that had no markings on them. In fact, the press would ask these soldiers, "Where are you from?" They wouldn't answer. They invaded a country, but they lied about their invasion. They claimed these were local defense forces that had rallied around the Russian flag. They made up this excuse that somehow the Russian-speaking population in the region was being oppressed and attacked and was in danger, and so they needed to intervene. Even to this day, they still will not admit the military role that they're playing on the ground in Crimea. So in addition to violating this international norm, which is an outrageous behavior, they have lied about it and think they can get away with it. And the point that I'm making is, if in the 21st century a country is allowed to invade a neighbor, lie about it, and lie about the reasons for it, and they can get away with it without significant costs, we have created a dangerous precedent with which we are going to have to live. Because all over the world there are powerful nations who now claim that land that they do not control belongs to them. I took a trip in February to Asia. I visited Japan and the Philippines and South Korea. And you know what the number one fear in that region is? That China has similar claims to Russia. They claim that all sorts of pieces of territory and of the oceans belong to them. They claimed it belonged to them 1,000 years ago and should belong to them now. Now, they've taken a different tact, but the point is, if we now live in a world where a country can make territorial claims and then simply act on them without any repercussions from the international community, then I think the 21st century is starting to look more and more like the early 20th century, a time that subjected the world to two devastating world wars. We cannot allow this to go unpunished. And I tell you that the only way that this can be punished is if the free countries of the world rally together and impose sanctions and costs for having taken this action on Vladimir Putin and on his cronies. And that will never happen. The free world will never be able to rally to impose those costs unless the United States of America leads that effort. We can't do it alone, but it cannot be done without us. And that's why it's so important that measures like the one the Senate now is considering happen with the highest amount of bipartisan support we can muster. We may not agree with every aspect of it. I certainly do not. But when you weigh the equities here, if you were to put this on a scale, the need to do something about Ukraine so far outweighs the things about this legislation before us that we don't like, because of the implications it has not just on our nation, but on the world, and the role we have. You know, if some other country around the world fails to pass sanctions, fails to take steps, or does so in a way that's divided, it might have some impact. But when the United States of America fails to act in a decisive way, it has a dramatic impact. You know, one of the arguments that our adversaries around the world use? They tell our allies, why are you still in the U.S. camp? Why are you still allying yourself with the United States? They are unreliable. Their government is always bickering and deeply divided. They can't come together in Washington to do anything. Do you think if you're ever invaded or ever get into trouble that the U.S. could possibly muster the domestic political support necessary for them to come to your assistance? Don't count on America. Count on us, or count on yourself. And I've already explained why there's danger in that. But that's the argument that these countries use against us. And what I fear is that if we fail to take decisive and unified action in this body, in the Senate, to send a strong message that while we may not all agree on every component of this, and I've already told you it was a mistake for the administration to push for that IMF sanction language, that IMF reform language, but I fear that if we do not send a strong and decisive message, then I think this will be spun against us. I think this will be used as evidence to our allies and other countries around the world why America is no longer reliable, either economically or militarily. And the consequences of that could extend far beyond Europe into other regions of the world like Asia. This is not a game. This is not some domestic political dispute. This issue has ramifications that will directly impact the kind of world that our children will inherit. In fact, it will dramatically impact the kind of world that you and I will have to live in over the next 20, 30, and 40 years. We cannot afford to make a mistake on this, and we cannot afford to be wrong. And so I hope that I can urge as many of my colleagues as possible to support this legislation with all of its flaws so that we can send a clear message that on these issues we are united as a people and as a nation, and that we remain committed to U.S. global leadership. Mr. President, thank you, and I yield.